Sound and speed, camera and speed, and welcome to another Create Greg video. In today's episode we will learn how to set up your camera manually to get the best quality picture, because using auto will never get the job done. This video aims for beginners, so if you're advanced and you decide to stick around, feel more than welcome to leave some feedback in the comment if you've got some cool solution. Without further ado, it all starts with finding the right location for our video. In ideal world we will get like a studio / separate room for shooting video, but I hope getting something like a living room with a big window, any window actually, can do the job. What is very important about the window, because if you don't want to invest money in additional light we will use later, we can leverage that big window as a huge source of soft light for us. So when you look at me going to the window and keeping sight of my face to the window, you see how light shapes the light and shadow on my face, give me more dimensional look. So now when you see all that YouTubers glued to the window, is because it gives them the nice soft look on the face and dimensional on the top of that. Next one is to find the proper framing, taking in consideration the position of our window, as well as pay attention what we've got in the background, midground and foreground of your framing, not to mention adding some prop to make it more interesting, like pillows, flowers, more flowers, candles, all relevant props to the story of the video, which might be enough. Now we have to face the challenge. It's almost end of the day in this part of the world and the sun is going down, namely I'm losing exposure for my video, and that is the biggest reason to invest in a key light, so you don't have to bother what's going on behind your window. Once we've got our key light set at 45 angle to give me this nice light and shadow on my face, we can eventually crack on with setting the one you're supposed to pay attention to get the most of your camera. I will use as example Sony, so for all you Canon users, if you are gone by now, it is what it is. But it doesn't change the fact, whatever camera you use, the basics are still the same. So if you learn in Sony system, you'll have to find the same parameters in your Canon, Panasonic, Nikon, whatever you use, and change them to get the most of your picture. We will start by choosing the file format. In our case, we go for HAVC S4K. For different brands, we will have a different codec, but the most important is to choose 4K, even if the delivery of your final video is 1080, because once you go for 4K and then you downscale in your video editing software, you will get better quality. On the top of that, you can zoom in to get even better framing without losing quality. Next thing, we need to choose a frame rate. In our case, we can choose between 24, 30, 60 and 120, and the higher doesn't mean the better, because everything above 30 like 60 and 120 will give us in slow motion, and for this kind of talking head videos we need either 24 or 30. If you shoot in the PAL system, you can get another 25 frames per second. That will do the job as well. Just remember, nothing above 30 frames per second or nothing below 24 frames per second, because then you will get the fast motion. Next on the list is white balance, and I cannot stress how important is this one, because if you got the wrong white balance, it will mess up the quality of the video in post-production. I know you can adjust in your video editing software, however, because you don't record a raw file, the file is coded in a certain way to minimize the size of the file. So if you record with the wrong white balance, you will not have enough data to recover the proper one. So be sure you set the right one. If you struggle with that, go to auto white balance, see which of the presets look similar to auto white balance and choose this one. Alternatively, you can buy a grade card and measure the white balance properly. Next, you have to be sure we're shooting in manual mode with choosing manual exposure. It will allow us to manipulate separately shutter speed, ISO and aperture. Let's start with the shutter speed. It's the only parameter we cannot control freely to adjust the exposure, because it needs to match our frame rate. if you ever heard about 180-degree rule, so basically our shutter speed needs to be twice of our frame rate. So if we are shooting 24 frames per second, our shutter speed is supposed to be 1/48. Because we do not have 48, it's 1/50. So if you decided to change frame rate from 24 to 30 frames per second, we can change our shutter speed to 1/60. First parameter we can control to get the best quality video and exposure is ISO. The higher the ISO, the higher the sensitivity on our sensor, and we can record in lower light situation. The drawback is the higher we set the ISO, the more grain and noise we introduce to our footage. So if you want to have the most clean footage, we try to keep the ISO as low as possible. With certain types of camera, they've got something which is called native ISO. This Sony camera has two of them. One is 800 and the other one is 12,800. With each of this ISO, you will get the cleanest image and the most dynamic range. This dual ISO applied to shooting in logarithmic scale to get the most dynamic range, and it's out of the scope of this video. Next on the list is aperture. So the higher the aperture, the less light we go through the lens to our sensor. The lower the aperture, the more light will get to our sensor. The lower the aperture, the more shallow is depth of field, which give you the cinematic look. In a plain English, your background is more blurry. Another worth thing to know with Sony camera is something which is called picture profiles. You can choose between different ones from logarithmic, HLG and cinetone. In general, keep them off to make your life easier in post-production and less steps in color grading. In order to get the proper exposure, manipulate aperture and ISO at the same time. So let's look at the tools within the camera which will tell you when you've got the right exposure. Some of the more advanced camera or external monitors will have built-in waveform as well as the false colors, and they are perfect tools to judge exposure immediately. However, with the most of the cameras you can find something which is called histogram. Histogram is the simple graph which you're supposed to find in your camera, and the easiest way to describe it is distribution of exposure in your video. So when you look at the left side of the histogram, that will be pure black, and then you look at the right side of the histogram, it will be pure white. Everything in the middle is proper exposure. Let's see how the histogram behaves when we close our aperture and reduce the amount of light hitting the sensor. As you see, the whole histogram moves to the left, which means our picture is properly underexposed. Let's open all the way up and we see how our picture is properly exposed. What if we decided to increase our ISO? The histogram moved to the right, so we see how the signal is clipped, and as a result of that, we will not be able to recover that signal. The way how I go about setting the exposure, I go with the aperture first to the lowest number as possible to keep that shallow depth of field, and then I balance that looking at the histogram with ISO. I try to keep the whole histogram in the middle. Sometimes I will push it slightly to the left or right, but at the end of the day, to keep in mind, stay away from the extreme left when you will crash the black, or extreme white when you will clip the signal. Another useful tool and complementary to our histogram is Zebra. If we look at Zebra, we've got the different settings. Let's go for 100 and plus, and this one will show us what part of our picture is overexposed by putting zebra pattern on that. It's very easy to spot overexposed parts of our picture and adjust exposure correctly by using ISO or iris. What's cool about the zebra as well, if you like to find a precise exposure, we don't have to limit ourselves to predefined one. We can set our own. So for instance, in C1, I set the range for 71 ±3, taking in consideration the proper exposure of our skin, going from around 50 for a darker color of skin to 70 for the white color of skin. We can nail precise the exposure for our talent. To get the best quality picture, I hope you know by now how to choose the right resolution and the frame rate, to read the exposure and nail it even further with zebra. zebra, what is left to improve your audio skills, which you can learn from this video. If you would like to deepen your knowledge about the exposure, this video will definitely help.